Give me the words to say. Because I don't know myself.
Hi, my name is Delmar Pete from Practically Pastoring, and I'm here today with a one-on-one with pastor and hospice care guru, Nathan Falco. I met Nathan back in 2007 as he was on the way out of CSU, and I was on the way in. Nathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dale. It's great to be with you again today.
It's good to see you, man. We've known each other for quite a while.
Yeah, going on 15 years or more?
That's insane. Just you saying that makes me feel old, bro. Like I didn't this early in the morning for that. But funny
Personally,
when
I prefer the word seasoned.
Oh, see, I already like where this conversation's going. But you were my fraternity president at Psi Kappa Phi at Charleston Southern when I was pledging in.
That's right.
So you
That's
saw
right. I remember many times toting you around the back of my car around town.
Yeah, how much of that can we share?
That was the back seat, not the trunk.
Yes, because that wasn't hazing, right? We didn't haze at all. No, I think sometimes I'll try to tell people I was in a Christian fraternity in college, and they would give me this like confusing puppy look, like, is that even possible? And it seems like an oxymoron at times, and sometimes I'm going to be honest. As I was pledging in that year, I I felt that a little bit myself. Um, how hard was it being the president of these little kids? You know, just pledging in straight out of high school.
When we carried around a title like Christian Service Fraternity, and you're right, I had a bunch of young guys right out of high school who barely knew what that was themselves. And honestly, as president, sometimes I was trying to figure out what it was. Uh, Sometimes it was a little like herding cats, you know, uh, because I kind of had the public eye on me because, when you're president, the buck stops with you. But there were a lot of opportunities for Christian witness, for Christian growth, um, and dialogue with the world, because we kind of turned on its ear what the world had come to learn was worldly,
Mm.
and I think that was really unique.
Yeah, I'm gonna be honest, man. I really never even planned on doing that when I went to college, and then I met you guys. But I will tell you, to your credit, the year I was a freshman pledging in, there's always one night you and I both know where most people quit, who are gonna quit, and I just remember you leaning into that conversation because after you left, I watched other guys do it poorly. Well, just quit, man. But I remember you just kind of stopping and saying, "Okay, I realize you're a little stressed out right now, but can we talk about that?" And I think that's the first time that I saw you more than just like a president of a club, but having what I would call the heart of a pastor.
Well, thank you, Dale. And really, that's in that context was partly where I began my own journey of self-discovery on the calling God would place later on my life to be a pastoral caregiver. At that time, I wasn't even expecting to work in hospice as a chaplain. I didn't even know what that was at the time. But even then, God was already starting to prepare me on that road, and I didn't even know it.
I'm telling you, man, that has been just watching you do this from afar. I have just envied what I've watched you learn and do. So how about that? Before we get into like the meat of this conversation, because I think today is one of those low hanging, practical fruit conversations. Can you just kind of explain in a nutshell what it is you do? Like, could you describe your job? It's a very specific pastoral job.
Yes, yes. My title is hospice chaplain, and I usually don't lean right into that when someone asks, "What kind of work do you do?" Because usually, if I reply with, "I'm a hospice chaplain," I either get another person's life story in response,
Mhm.
or it just shuts down the conversation because people are like, "Oh, you're a hospice chaplain. I'm done with this conversation," because it's uncomfortable when we hear the word hospice.
Mm.
And people are kind of unsure what is a chaplain. So, hospice in a nutshell is, I view it as a healthcare ministry. Really, it is a healthcare field in terms of the world, but its purpose is to alleviate the suffering of those who are dying.
Mm,
And that's not just those who are in that 11th hour right before death, but it's those, includes those who have just been given news that, their condition is no longer treatable and they only have maybe 6 months or maybe a little more. So we
mm,
help them on that journey in all types of suffering, whether it's physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual. And where I come in is with the spiritual suffering,
mm,
and that's the chaplain part. A chaplain is not a preacher. We don't go and preach messages to people like your pastor does in the pulpit. We don't explicitly evangelize like a missionary does, although we do all those things when the atmosphere is right. Uh, Someone described pastoral care to me as the back door of evangelism. In other words, you meet people from every walk of life, Protestant, Catholic, Christian, non Christian, atheist, um, and you meet them where they are, you find out what their needs are, and then you respond to those needs in the best way you can. And sometimes those needs lead you to an opportunity to present the plan of salvation or
mm.
to provide spiritual truths that promote growth in a person's faith. And sometimes, if it's out of your scope of practice, you find a person who can provide the care that you can't provide. So that's the
Mm.
essence of what a chaplain does.
Just recently, you really helped me out of a bind. And that's why I know that we need to have this conversation, because you know about what happened with that passing of a older man that I just experienced, where hospice in this town I'm in, Sumter, not your hospice you're a part of, Nathan, a different one. They kind of were dropping the ball, and I got called in to this older person's house because they didn't have a pastor, and they were like, "Listen, we just need someone here." And his wife and daughter-in-law got a hold of me, and I showed up. I didn't have a clue what to do. Now, I've been to a few bedsides, but when you think, well, hospice has got this handled, why are they calling me? you know, um, and I showed up, and he was already kind of in the final stages of life, and he was, you probably know the term for it, but he was collecting fluid in his mouth, and they needed something to extract that, and the daughter-in-law called hospice, and they said, basically, almost verbatim, he's about to die anyways. We don't have any of those suction things. By the time we had you on, he would be dead. And then they said, call us when he's gray. And I'm in the room when all that's happening, and I'm like, I don't even know what to do. I don't even know this man's name, you know? And I remember you and I had been talking, and one of the things you had told me before was, Dell, you just find a way to be present, because you're there in the final stages, which is a lot of people's last memory with their loved ones. And I remember the wife of the man, she was just so nervous because he was spitting up. She goes to the kitchen and grabs a turkey baster, dude, and she puts a turkey baster in his mouth and is starting to suck this stuff up. And I'm watching this man basically almost about to pass away, and his wife has a turkey baster in his mouth, and I'm like, I don't know what to do. I said, can I walked up to him and said, hey, listen, I know this is really stressful. I don't know what I can offer. Can I pray? And they said, we would love, please pray. So we got around this man's bedside table, and we prayed. I'm be honest, Nathan, it was not some fantastic prayer. I didn't have a clue what I was doing, bro. I was channeling my inner Nathan, and then but I prayed, and then they said, thank you so much, and then I left, and I got a call like 5 minutes later from the daughter-in-law saying, as you were pulling out the driveway, we lost his pulse. And then the thing she said to me basically was, we're so glad our last memory with him is not with a turkey baster in his mouth, but it's standing beside his bed praying with him as he met his creator. And I think, you know, at that bedside, that was me, but it was also a culmination of like some of the conversations I've had with you, because I think one of the things I'm learning as a pastor is there are some things that are natural and there are some things that definitely get better with teaching and training. Um, so I just have I wanted to ask you a couple questions that I've asked you in private, but then some of them I haven't ever asked you for because I just kind of want to know. But like for the pastor who's about to step into a stressful situation, be it mourning, be it like someone has just got horrible news, um, and you're outside the room. I think for me, being outside the room is the most nerve wracking because you know you're about to step into something that maybe emotionally I'm not there because I might have just came out of my son's birthday party or something. So how do you step into a room with a family that's hurting?
Good question. Good question. And to be honest, that is a struggle that never goes away. I mean, even after 8 years experience working in hospice full time, I still have that struggle myself sometimes because we're human and we live in this moment and we carry all of our past experiences forward. So, yeah, there's sometimes when I have to be really versatile, spiritually and emotionally. I might have just come from a
Mhm.
birthday party and then I'm stepping into someone's final moments. I mean, that's an incredible switch to make.
Mm,
Um, so you're not alone in that, and it's okay to give yourself a measure of grace on that.
mm,
Um, and the first thing I would say, as far as how do you come into that room, in one word, humbly, humbly, uh, recognizing that first of all, what you're about to do is not done in your own power. It does partly depend on you, but ultimately it depends on God working through you. Your part depends on being there and being available and being willing. God does the rest. And so you are several very important things to the people in that room. First of all, you're a guest. You are a guest of honor. So try not to have a commanding presence when you come in the room because you are a guest, but do come in the room with the authority that comes with that person inviting you into their most sensitive, private place of pain. They have a very painful moment they're going through, but they have called you to be the person that can heal those wounds. That's a privilege. That's an honor. And you are able to go where no one else has been invited to go, or maybe they have been, but they've not been willing to go. Um, so you're also a shepherd to that family. Despite your own personal theology, whatever it might be, in the eyes of that hurting person, you are literally bringing the presence of God into their valley of the shadow at that moment. They equate your presence with the presence of God. And that presence itself will bring comfort, even if you never say a word. I have had moments myself where I'm invited into a hospital room with someone who is dying or otherwise suffering, and I might have no idea what to say to this family. But they've invited me there, and I just sit quietly with them. And I might say nothing the whole time. And then when the times come to leave, I leave. And then later, I'm thinking, what in the world did I do to even help these people? And I hear a feedback later from a nurse or a doctor or someone who says, that family was so thankful for what you did for them. You were so helpful. And I'm thinking, I didn't even say a word. But it was the fact of my very presence that I was there. Um, and so when you come into that room, um, just a simple greeting, introductions to people that you don't know, making physical contact with each person as soon as you can is important because making that physical contact kind of confirms we were together. There's something about that physical touch that really adds to the experience for the other person. And finally, you're also an authority. You're a religious and moral authority to that person, whatever their background might be. In their eyes, you have the answers that they seek. Now, perhaps you personally may not have specific answers, but you believe in the one who does have those answers, and they associate you with that. So you can give them guidance and direction. You can, for lack of a better term, talk them off the ledge if needed. When they're in that moment of panic or confusion. Their minds and souls are often fractured by the crisis. They need you to be a sounding board and a moral compass as they are mulling over important decisions whose consequences will stay with them the rest of their lives, perhaps. And so, being that guest, being that shepherd, and being that authority, that's what you come into the room with. So, just
Man. You know, oftentimes when I get a pastoral call, you walk into the room. I mean, I cannot speak for a pastor, but you walk into the room and you're like, I know that I'm here, but when you codify it in those terms, to me, it helps you know how to operate a little bit more.
you have an authority and a right to be there
Hmm.
because you've been asked to be there and because of the office you hold. And so it's important to feel free to exercise the authority of your office, but you do it with humility, knowing that you're the under shepherd.
Hmm.
And God is the one who's ultimately guiding everything, but you are looking for the cues that that person will give you as to what they need from you.
Well, here's a question then. So we're picking up the cues from what they need. But I also know there's oftentimes we misread that sometimes, especially if we're nervous. Sometimes we have a hard time picking up on social cues, especially if we haven't maybe done this a lot. Are there some ditches that you would like definitely stay out of these ditches? Don't do these things.
Yes, that is a very good question. And I have to always remind myself of that uh, because there are certain guardrails, if you will, that are helpful to follow. Um, you know, One of the most important things is to talk a lot less than you listen. I always like the old adage, God gave you two ears and one mouth because he wants you to
Yeah.
listen twice as much as you speak. But there's actually scripture to back that up. In Ecclesiastes, it says um, that the more words oftentimes we use, the more grief it can cause. And James says everyone should be quick to listen and so slow to speak. And that can be key because we can't know how to help someone. And we won't know what to say if we're the only one talking. I literally was in a hospital room when a family's pastor arrived. And typically, the pastor is one of the best people to help them because you already have that working relationship with them
Hmm.
on a spiritual level. Whereas, me being a chaplain, I might only meet them for the very first time when they're at their worst moment. And I don't know where they're coming from. But this guy comes into the room and he's with the family, and I could tell he was nervous, and I don't hold that against him at all. But it's just what he did with that nervousness.
Hmm.
He didn't know what else to talk about, so he talked about his church, which can be helpful. Telling the person
Right.
what's going on at church. They may not have been at church in a while. It helps them feel connected when they hear, this is what we're doing at church lately. But he didn't stop there. He kept talking more and more about his church, and he talked about himself and about his own ministry. And he was there for about maybe 10 minutes and talked about himself the whole time. And no one in the room had an opportunity to tell him what it was they needed from him.
Oh,
Um, and he closed with a prayer, uh, but the prayer couldn't really be specific to their needs other than a need for healing, obviously, because they were in the hospital, because he didn't really listen to what they had to
he
say.
didn't listen.
So that's
Mm.
very key. Um, Another thing with that prayer, it's important not to use prayer like a band aid. We're tempted to do that as pastors because usually, like at the first sign of trouble, we think, okay, we need to pray about this. Well, that may be true. There will be time to pray about it. But let's not do that necessarily first, because oftentimes prayer can actually shut down a conversation that needs to happen. So So pray it when you feel that the moment is right. Once that person has had a chance to really talk through their issues, and allow yourself to mourn with those who mourn. Um, like Job's friends. We often joke, Job Job's friends were doing great until they opened their mouths. They just sat and listened to him
Yeah.
for a while. Um, so certainly keep your mouth closed at first, and you'll know when the time is right to speak.
Hmm.
A couple other things is very important. Do not attempt to convince the person that you know how they feel or what it's like, unless you literally do know that from your own experience. And then it would be actually helpful to share some of your own experience, whatever you feel comfortable sharing, but do it in a way that brings the focus back onto them. Don't bring the focus onto yourself. Um, so otherwise, don't try to convince them that you know what it's like, because you don't, unless you've been in those shoes. And also, with that, don't, even though it may be tempting, don't try to convince the person that everything's going to be okay, because honestly, I mean, only God knows the future. And you may have dealt with this issue many times. You may know how it turns out for other people, but you don't really know how it's going to turn out for them. And so you can't really say with authority, it's going to be okay. If you do, and it doesn't turn out to be okay, then they're less likely to trust you the next time. So try to avoid that. Um, Also, um, don't avoid the person. Don't ignore them. I know it's very easy to do, because we get that phone call, and it's like, oh, please, I need to talk. I need someone to talk to. And you're thinking, I have no idea what to say. I don't know how to deal with this. And so you kind of like tend to put off that visit or put off that phone call just because you don't know what to say. But what I hear time and time again is that people are able to forgive a misspoken word more easily than they're able to forgive never getting a call. Wow, because never getting a call or never getting a visit communicates, I don't care, or I don't have time for you. Well, that may not be true. You may have avoided for very good reasons. It's important to keep in contact. And that's more than simply saying, call me if you need me. I know we're all busy. We got a lot of irons in the fire in a pulpit ministry. And so it's tempting to say, call me if you need me. But that communicates to the person, okay, the ball's now in your court. It's your responsibility to call me if you need help and ask for help. Well, that person's already dealing with a crisis. So we've just added a layer of responsibility to that. What would be a better way to phrase that? You want to be there for them? Well, a better way to phrase that is to say, just offer to call them. Like, say they've just gotten the news today from the doctor, okay? And they're going for a follow up appointment in a couple of days. Say, okay, well, I'll call you after your next appointment just to check in with you. Or maybe you don't have time for the conversation right then. Just communicate how important it is to them, and say, I want to give you my undivided attention. So let's set up a good time we can sit down and talk. That gives you the freedom to pick a time that's good for you, but it also doesn't really put them off necessarily.
I had another question down, and I think you brushed past it just now in your answer a little bit, but I think I would want to park on it a second. And that was, the ministry of presence. And what I'm hearing you saying is, like, literally the art to it is just being there. like literally physically being there. Now I'm thinking back to a couple situations in my own mind. Admittedly, pastors, a lot of times we're like hardwired to make a connection with somebody, because that's how we start the shepherding process. And so we do. We're like, oh, you went to this high school, I went to this high school, and then I've now made the conversation about me, and then, like you said, once you get to the part where you're praying for them, or even if you get called in to do the funeral, You don't know anything about this family, but they know all about you now. So, what would you say? How much presence is like too much, both physically, like in the room, as far as you owning the room, and then how? When should you? When's a good mental cue to be like, okay, I probably should leave now and let this family have. I'm a guest who's wearing his welcome out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, good question. And I'd like to back up first, if I could, and talk about
Hmm.
really what it means to be present.
Yeah.
Because I think if we can define that, it'll be easier to identify like how much is too much. Because it is possible to have too little and too much, and we want to find that right balance. Um, and it really kind of touches across four dimensions: um, being physically present, being spiritually present, being emotionally present, and being mentally present. And just real briefly on touching on each of those, physically present means just that, being there. Um, if 80% of communication is nonverbal, like we commonly hear, if you're not literally there, then you can't address 80% of what is being said because you can't observe body language, facial expressions. Um, so it's very important. Next, it means spiritual presence, preparing yourself before you go. Pray, stay connected to the Lord, and get spiritually centered. You may have just come from that birthday party. You might have just come out of an argument with your spouse. You may have just come out of a really tense deacons meeting. Whatever it is that you've just come out of, you don't want to carry that into your next meeting. So take a minute and deal with that. Um, the success of your visit ultimately depends on the Holy Spirit working in you, not on your own abilities. So I'd recommend pray along Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. That was our guiding verse in PsyCap 5. Trust in the
Hmm.
Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. That's very true in a pastoral care visit because you need a lot of leading from the Lord because you don't know where it's going to go. On being emotionally present, that means be willing to go with the person emotionally wherever they might need you to go. Part of being able to do that is checking your own emotional baggage at the door because we all have it. Whatever conflicts, pains, stressors you carry with you into the room, that's going to affect how you are able to emotionally identify with the person in need. You can't really help that person talk through a conflict they have in a relationship if you're still emotionally dealing with the conflict you just had with your wife, for instance. you know so you got to be able to check that, and you got to be willing to go there, and you may not be able to go everywhere a person goes, and that's okay because you're human. They don't expect you to be Superman. You just do the best you can, and don't try to go emotionally to a place when you feel warning signs going off in your own heart, because that's not going to help either one of you. So that's a way you can give too much presence emotionally, is when you feel you're crossing your own emotional boundaries. Uh, but finally, being mentally present. That means turning off as many distractions as possible from the moment you enter the door. Silence your phone unless you're expecting a phone call that's life or death. You know, in that case, you would let the person know. Hey, I might get a phone call that I just have to take. I don't want to, but I'm just going to have to. But otherwise, don't. Um, and don't be thinking about your schedule or your daily issues that you have going on that day, except keeping in mind when you have to leave, because obviously you don't want to miss your next appointment, but just keep it in mind and don't obsess about it. And learn the skills of active listening, which we might talk about a little bit later on. That's taught by Carl Rogers. It's a set of hardly defined skills that helps you really engage with the person on an individual level when they're talking. Basically, when you're with the person, nothing else in the world is more important. Okay, that's the essence of being present. So then it leads the question to how much is too much, as you say. Well, I'm tempted to say it's difficult to be too present because all too often, I mean, as as self-centered human beings that we naturally are, we're naturally focused on ourselves and what we have going on in
Right.
our world. It's easy to get distracted, and it's easy to not be present enough. Uh,
Mm.
but in all cases, allow the other
Mm.
person to lead you. Don't force yourself on them. If you offer to make a visit and they say, no thanks, I think I'm okay, then trying to visit anyway would be being too present. Um,
Okay.
but if you offer a visit and they say, no, I don't think that's necessary, offer to just talk on the phone and try to get them
Mm.
engaged. Avoid yes or no questions. Try to ask open-ended questions that get them talking. And they'll tell you in that conversation, either explicitly or they'll just indicate that they don't really have much of substance that they need to talk about. They might say, "Oh, I really am doing okay with this. I know it's all going to be okay. Or especially whether in the phone or in person, if the conversation turns away from the issue of the moment and starts turning on to you, where they start talking about,
Mm.
well, how are you doing, Pastor? How are things going at the church? Or they might start talking about current events, like, what do you think about this
Mm.
election? Or what do you think about these news events or whatever?
Right.
If it starts turning towards mundane topics, that's an indication that the person is kind of finished talking about their issues.
Okay. So that's a cue that you've actually been present and you might winding down that kind of session. Okay.
Yes. And if you're ever unsure, um, look for signs, like if the person you're talking to is physically ill themselves, look for signs
Mm.
of fatigue. Do they look
Mm.
tired? Because conversation takes effort, and at a certain point they will get worn out, and you don't want to be a burden. So look for signs of fatigue, or look for signs of loss of interest in the conversation that you've been having. And at that point, if you're unsure whether you're still needed, it's okay to ask questions like, how else can I help you today? Or is there anything else we can talk about today? Or just kind of sum up your conversation and say, hey,
Mm.
we've talked about an awful lot today, and I know that's been a heavy conversation. Is there anything more you want to talk about right now? And they'll tell you either yes or no. And if they say, well, I can't really think of anything, or no, I think you've helped me with everything on my mind, then that's your cue. Hey, let's wrap this up and get out the
Mm.
door. Typically a pastoral care visit will last maybe 15 to 20 minutes. Sometimes that
Okay.
may take
That's
up
good to
to an
know.
hour,
Yeah.
especially on a first meeting where it's a
Mm.
couple and they're having real strains. You might be there up to 2 hours if you if
Mm.
if you have the time. But by and large, the person will tell you when they're done if you're able to read the cues.
Mm. And I've missed those before. I went and visited somebody at a hospital about an hour and a half away, and I missed the cues, and it ended up with me sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, thinking I was being present, and then the family comes in, and now I'm like, I gotta leave. But now I've kind of pigeonholed myself into sitting in this room, and now it's like it's gonna be rude because I missed the opportunity. I think a fair question that maybe many of us would have is, say we are sitting, and because a lot of times we are being present. I hate to just stand up and say, "Okay, I'm gonna go now." Like, how do you leave um, a visit? How do you appropriately leave?
That's just as important as how you enter.
Mm.
Good question. Because you want to do it gracefully,
Mm.
and you want to do it in a way that leaves them feeling like they've been heard, their life's been touched, and they've been helped.
Mm.
So you definitely don't want to leave before you have some sense from that person that you have met their needs. So I go back to, it's okay to verbally assess that at some point in the conversation, as we've said.
Mm.
Is there anything else I can help you with? You can also just kind of observe how the conversation is flowing. If they had been talking to you at length and now they're talking to each other for a while, it's okay to, when there's a break in the conversation, just to say, hey, I want to thank you for letting me be here with your family. But unless there's something else I can do for you right now, I'm going to step out for a few minutes, let you guys have some time together as a family, some privacy.
Mm.
If you think it might be needed with that family, you could say, I'll check back in with you maybe in a few minutes. Or you might just say, if there's anything else you need, I'll be glad to do that while I'm here. But otherwise, I'm going to go and I can call you later. Just kind of give them some sense that you'll still be in touch.
I like that way you worded that. It's almost like you were building an exit ramp by saying something like, it's been such an honor to hang out with you, or, say it, more sincerely, but just thank you for your time to be here with you. Like, it's almost like you're building a social exit ramp and you're like, hey, you want me to take this ramp?
Yes, definitely ease into it. You don't want to drop a hat like,
Oh, look at the time, Yeah, okay. That's fair. Because I think some people, I've been on the call. I've actually received pastoral care personally myself before, and I was kind of in mid thought, and the pastor goes, "Well, I gotta go," and I was like, "Oh, okay, okay," and it kind of made it hard for me to warm up to him again.
so a couple of sticking points might be if you're with someone who is very talkative, like they're just talking on and on and on, and you're listening, you're doing a good job listening, you want to be there, but they just don't seem to have an end in sight. And you're thinking, I got to be at a deacon's meeting in 15 minutes.
Real talk. Yeah.
Like, what do you do with that? So that's why I say always keep in mind when you have to leave. Always begin your visit with the end in mind. And so you know how long it's going to take you to get where you have to go next. So give yourself some cue. Maybe you could set a little buzzer on your phone that
Hmm.
says, okay, I know I need 15 minutes to get to my next appointment, so I'm going to set this buzzer for 10 minutes before that. And when you feel that buzzer go off, you might say to the person, okay, just kind of find a way to ease into that conversation, or just say, hey, I need you to pause you just for a moment. I want to hear what you have to say, but I just want to let you know I've just got a few minutes left. So
Okay.
let's, you know, I want to invite you to share with me what's the most pressing thing on your mind right now in the last few minutes that
Mm.
we have. And in doing that, you're kind of priming the pump, where you've
Okay.
said to the person, I've only got a few minutes left. So now they're aware
Mm.
of that. So then the next time you say it, you can say, okay, that's about all the time I have for today. Maybe we can talk more next time. Maybe let's close with a prayer, and talk
Mm.
about that. So again, you can kind of ease into it. The other thing is, what do I do? How do I tell non-verbally if a person still needs me? Um, if that person still has tears in their eyes,
Mm.
okay, that's a good
Yeah.
cue. If that
Mm.
person is still holding your hand,
Mm.
if you're holding tightly to their hand, that's one thing. But
Right.
if they're holding tightly to your hand, they're not done with you.
Mm.
Okay, so
So
that's
hang
just a
in there.
couple things
Yeah.
to look for. Yeah.
No, that's really good. I think one of the things that I've missed before is because you can get ahead of yourself in the room. You can, kind of like when you're preaching, you're already thinking about how am I going to land the sermon while I'm on point number 2, and I think it's really easy to get into like, okay, how am I going to land this session? Meanwhile, I'm missing those social cues. I'm missing those verbal cues. And you said something a second ago. I love to revisit that because you were talking about active listening, and I think that's one of the things what I've seen helps keep us in that room in the present sense a little bit more. Can you give us a little bit of like how do you active listen when you're with anyone who's in counseling like that?
Yeah. Um, the most important skills of active listening are all nonverbal. Uh, eye contact. Okay. By and large, eye contact is a sign of respect. And so it communicates to that person, you have my full attention. You can give too much eye contact. I wouldn't recommend staring at someone, without any break.
Yeah.
Okay,
Hi. Yeah.
because that can make them uncomfortable. Uh, but when you're talking to them, make eye contact. When they're talking to you, make eye contact. Um, it's okay to occasionally glance around, but always come back to them, and definitely don't be looking at something else like your phone or something like that while they're talking to you, because that says I'm distracted. Um, Also, just your posture. Here's a key: match the posture of the other person. If that other person is kind of laid back on the couch, kind of relaxed, do the same thing. Because if you're sitting on the edge of your seat leaning forward while they're relaxed, that's going to communicate, it's going to make them feel like you're tense. Okay. But if they're tense, if they're sitting on the edge of their seat, if they're leaning forward, they're tapping their foot, you don't have to do all that, but you can sit forward in your seat. There's actually a position, I forget the specific name of it. I think it's called the sprint position, where you can sit, and I can't demonstrate it right now on this call because you can't see all of me. But basically, it is putting your feet up under your chair so
Okay.
your toes are touching the floor, okay,
Okay.
and sitting up straight and leaning slightly forward,
Okay.
okay. That
Yeah.
communicates I am really interested in what's right in front of me,
Okay.
non-verbally.
Hmm.
So that's really good. The expression on your face really helps. Always be aware of that. Do I have a hard look on my face? Does my face feel tense? Am I smiling while this person is weeping? You know, just make sure that you're congruent with what's going on. And one other thing is, non-verbally speaking, um, do you have what's called an open or closed position? If I'm sitting here with my arms crossed, that's what we call a closed position, and that communicates that I'm closed up, that I'm kind of pensive or not really emotionally warm. But if I were to open my arms and I sit back and I'm relaxed like this, and the same
It's
goes with
totally
your
different.
legs,
Yeah.
keeping your legs crossed or uncrossed, which I know for any female caregivers that may be listening, that might be a different kind of issue because you might be wearing a skirt and you might want to keep your legs crossed. And then in that case, that's socially acceptable. That's different. Um, but especially keeping your arms uncrossed is helpful. As far as the verbal cues of active listening, communicate to the person that you're listening, as in follow the conversation with words like, okay, yeah, I hear you. Or if there's a pause in their conversation, allow the pause. That can be very helpful because it gives them time to think. It can also give you time to think. Uh, but after there's been a little bit of a pause, if they don't say anything else, you could just say, can you tell me more about that? Or as you've done a couple of times, Dale, you could say, let me go back to something you said a minute ago. That communicates, I'm really listening to what you have to say. Um, you can also, what's very helpful is reflect back to the person what they've said to you. If they've said a lot, like paragraphs, you can just summarize it. You could just say, if I heard you right, let me summarize what you just said. And then they'll tell you either yes or no. If you didn't get it right, they'll correct you. And that's really to your benefit.
Yeah. Okay.
And very importantly, reflect the feeling that you think is behind what they're saying. You could say, wow, that sounds really scary. Or that sounds really angering, you know? Or if I was in that situation, I would feel, this right here. Or you might even just say, wow, it really feels like no one's listening to what you have to say.
Yeah.
And you yourself probably know how relieving it is to have someone say that. You say, oh, yeah, yeah, I really feel like no one's heard me. So that's in an essence active listening. But if you actually Google active listening by Carl Rogers, Carl Rogers, there's a huge amount of resources out there that can give you concrete, specific skills um, to look for and to learn.
That's helpful. That's and on that note, I think you probably know some places where we can go to learn more about all of this that we wouldn't even know what well to go to draw that from. So as far as books, literatures, do you have any books that you would just recommend to us just to go further down this rabbit hole?
Yes, yes, there are lots of books out there. There's no need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to providing care, and it can be really bewildering if you don't feel educated or trained on the subject matter that you're working on. So, just like um, all of us as pastors do when we are studying for our sermons, pay attention to the author. Okay, titles are good, but authors are better to study. Learn as much as you can about the person, their background, their theology, kind of the angle that their perspective takes, because that'll tell you whether or not that person's teachings are going to be congruent with your theology. And it's okay to find someone who isn't completely congruent with your theology, because that can stretch you, and that can be a learning moment for you to kind of broaden your perspective, because the people you care for are coming from all different types of backgrounds, and that can help you identify with them. So I've come across a few books that I want to recommend. These are specific more to the issues of pain, that is spiritual and emotional pain, loss, and dying, because those are some of the heaviest issues that we face in life. Um, so I have some that I want to just go through one at a time, real briefly. Yeah. One is called When Is It Right to Die? I don't know if you can see this, if it's turning my screen backwards, but When Is It Right to Die by Joni Eareckson Tada. You may have recognized that name. She was an Olympic athlete. She was a diver. When she was just coming out of her teenage years, she had a diving accident. She broke her neck. She was paralyzed from the neck down for the rest of her life. And in this book, she is going to outline her journey of recovery. She spent 2 years in an acute care hospital.
Wow.
She couldn't even move any more than her head, and she journeys she catalogs her journey of physical suffering and spiritual suffering as she searches questions like, is it okay for me to die now? How do I live now? What does all this mean? Uh, when should I give up? And this is an incredible book where she is going to argue for life at all costs, life despite everything. She's going to argue against pulling the plug on life support. She's going to argue against suicide. She's going to argue against euthanasia. All those things in favor of life. And it's written from a Christian perspective. It's wonderful.
That sounds good, yeah.
Yes, very good book. Another one that I would recommend from a Christian author, you may have heard, this is A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is a staple in Christian literature, and A Grief Observed is his own personal account of grief and loss, and how he experienced that, and how he found comfort and hope and meaning. This is a great companion to any pastor who wants to know what it's like to personally experience this and what your people might be going through. Another one is, I'll go ahead and say this one. This is On Death and Dying by Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. This one I would not recommend as your first read because it's pretty heavy. It gets into some real detailed theories. Elisabeth Kubler-Ross was not a pastor. She was a psychologist who worked with pastors, and she kind of helped start pastoral care ministry in a hospital setting back in the 70s. And this is going to be her account of thousands of people that she interviewed who were dying and what she learned of them. And she came up with that 5 stages of grief theory that you always hear about. So I would recommend this once you've read some other books. Okay, so that's kind of a heavy read, but it's helpful nonetheless. And then finally, a couple more. This one is called Night. It's by an author named Ellie Wiesel. Ellie Wiesel. I'm not sure I got that right. Now, Ellie Wiesel is not Christian. He is Jewish. So he's going to write what he is talking about from a Jewish perspective. But he is a very devout Jew, so he believes in the God of the Old Testament. And this account is his personal experience of World War II concentration camps. He was taken to Auschwitz, then he was taken to Buchenwald, and during there he witnessed the death of each member of his family. And then he's also experiencing his own suffering, and so he's going to explore questions of how could a loving God let this happen? And how do I find God in the valley of the shadow of death? And as I said, he's writing it from a Jewish perspective, but nonetheless, he's writing it from a religious perspective. And he's asking a lot of the same questions that we as Christians would ask. And so this is a powerful personal insight into what people experience in the deepest suffering. And then another one, very good. This is a groundbreaking work called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Again, another Jewish author, again, written from experience in World War II. But Viktor Frankl was a psychologist before World War II. He wrote his theory called logotherapy. Okay? Logo taken from the Greek word or meaning, a message, and therapy, meaning healing. And his theory is that what gives us ultimate meaning in life is that which we find most important to us. It's not the search for pleasure like Freud thought. It's not the search for knowledge or anything. It's the search for what is most personally important to us. And as Christians, that's our faith. Okay, that's what gives us meaning. And so, interestingly, Viktor Frankl wrote his theory just before he was arrested by the Nazis and put into a concentration camp where he began living his theory.
Living it.
He lived it and tested it, and he says that is what helped him survive. And this book has sold 17 million copies around the world. It's been translated into 50 languages. Definitely worth reading.
That is the most ironic twist in a book. That is so ironic. Yeah, you write it, and then God's like, "Oh, now you get to live it." Phew, okay.
Yes. And the last one I want to recommend real quick, I don't actually have it with me because it's at my office, unfortunately, because I refer to it so often. It's called The Wounded Healer by Henry Nouwen. The Wounded Healer by Henry Nouwen. That's spelled HenriNouwen. Nouwen. Henry Nouwen is a Catholic monk. So he's going to write his work from a slightly Catholic perspective, but what he's focusing on is how do we help someone who is spiritually wounded? And we do that from a place of our own woundedness. By being in touch with our own pain and our own wounds, that gives us the resources that we can draw upon to say, I hear you, I can identify with you, and together we can find healing. It's a short read. I think it's maybe like 100 pages. But in those pages, it's packed full of wisdom.
So if you're wanting to really jump into this, that would be a great primer book. Would you consider it just to kind of get you down the path?
Yes, that was actually one of my first books on my reading list when I took back at CSU when you and I were in undergrad. I took a pastoral counseling class with Dr. Wendell Gary. I don't know if you remember Dr. Gary.
No, I remember Dr. Gary. He gave me a B. He gave me a B in preaching class because he said I preached too loud. Now the irony on that is, if you know anything about Dr. Gary, he had a hearing aid. So yes. I felt like, man, I really need to tone it down some.
Yes, yes, yes. That was one of the first books he ever recommended me to read, and that has stayed with me. That was seminal in my journey as a pastoral caregiver.
Yeah, I think one of the things I see a commonality in a lot of these books, and I think this might be a good exercise just for me as a pastor. It seems like a lot of these books are saying these are the questions people are asking in grief, and we need to be familiar with those questions before they're necessarily thrust upon us.
We have to answer those questions ourselves
Mm,
first. Because in order to explore those questions, we have to be willing to explore our own valley of shadows and
mm.
our own pain and grief. And if you're thinking, all these topics are depressing, they're scary, or it's just gonna get me all upset, well, that may be true. Seek it in prayer, cover it in prayer. Find a trusted friend that you can talk through these issues about, because you got to address these questions yourself before you're ready to address them for anyone else.
Man, that's good. Like learning all of the questions, and I know some questions you're just not going to be ready for. You know, I know at our church, we have pastor who's on call that week, and one week I got a call, and it was Dell, we need you to go pray with this man, and I believe it was Florence. So it was actually your neck of the woods, Florence, South Carolina. He just had his foot amputated, diabetic, and so now he's dealing with, a missed appendage. So I go into the room and I'm like, I don't know what to say. I didn't know all these things. I think this was my first year here, even at the church I'm at now. And I walked in the room and this was his first thing he said to me. Oh, so you're the guy who drove the short straw. I was like, okay, so this isn't going to be a normal pastoral call meeting, actually. But for me, what I learned is, man, that's a blessing when you have someone you're caring for who knows how to break the ice. Because oftentimes breaking the ice is you have to be gentle so it doesn't smash all over the place. So
And
being
one of the hardest things to get around is when you ask somebody how you're doing and they say, "I'm fine." The best way to avoid that is to not ask that question,
never asked that
because
question.
people expect that question, "How are you?" And the automatic answer is, "I'm fine." And so maybe kind of preface it with, you know, "Man, last time we talked, you said you had a lot going on. I just want to see how you've been doing since then," or just kind of follow up on those issues. Additionally, man, if you're meeting with somebody who's laying in a hospital bed, okay, and you
Yeah.
ask how you doing, and they say, "Oh, I'm fine," you can kind of just do a double take on that, and you say, "Are you sure? Because you're in a hospital bed right now."
Yeah,
And
Yeah.
oftentimes I say that, and it makes the person kind of think twice about what they just said, because they didn't even think
that's
about what they
fair.
said. And they're like, "Oh, that's a good point. Okay, well, maybe I'm not quite so fine," and then they talk.
Or option B, you just look extremely not checked in. One time, the first one I ever did, I was 18, man, and a guy who I went to high school with, he got in a bad car accident, like almost lost his arm, almost lost his life. I walked in the room, I didn't know what to say. I just said, "How are you?" He goes, "I'm literally almost dead, bro." Like, wrong question. I was like, "Okay, thanks, Ryan. I'm learning off your back here." So, um,
But
but
you can actually build on those things, because, like, suppose he had said, I'm literally almost dead," or "I literally almost died." Try to identify what feelings might go with that, and just
there you
say,
go.
"Wow, that sounds like that was a scary experience. Tell me more." Because the person has now told you, "I'm ready to talk about being dead or almost being dead."
Yeah. So that's good. So like you can even take what you would consider like a botched sentiment and like probe it for the emotion that you've gotten back. I like that. So that's good because a lot of times I'm afraid, am I going to say the right thing or the wrong thing? But it's like, well, like you said earlier, you're saying something, which is better than nothing. So whatever response you get, try to check into the emotion behind that response. Is that fair?
Yes, yes, including humor, because humor is a coping tool. So you might get a really unexpected response, like your person who is in a crisis cracks a joke. Okay, and that's a sign that they may be either either they're already coping well enough that the situation is not bothering them like you might expect, or it's bothering them that bad that they have to laugh so they don't cry. And so you can kind of gently point that out with something like, wow, I love your sense of humor. I never would expect someone in a crisis like this to be able to laugh. And then just kind of leave it there and just let them respond to that and see what they
That's
say.
good.
Because you're kind of calling them on it gently, you know? So, yeah. Yeah. Well, hey, Nathan, I'm going to have to close our timeout right now. But really quick, I just want to let everyone who's listening right now know I'm going to put all Nathan's resources down in the show notes. I'm going to pick up a few of these books as well. Especially that one. It sounds real fun, like you're swimming in mud. But I think the truth be told, sometimes those are the ones that plowing through really do help us get to the questions. But today, I actually don't want to take the last word. I want to give you the last word, Nathan. So I want to ask you a question. I'm going to let you kind of answer it and close it out. Sound cool? All right. So I'm a pastor. I just got a call and I'm about to step into a tense situation, any generic pastoral care situation. What's the one phrase or thing that I should utter before my mind before I walk into any pastoral care?
Good question. And I would say that the one thing that you should say to yourself before you go into any pastoral care situation is a simple prayer. God, speak through me. Give me the words to say. Because I don't know myself.
Yeah. Well, Nathan, thank you for all your words today, bro. I love you, man.
Love you too, bro. Thanks for your time. Look forward to the next time.